A loan is supposed to be a simple thing. A person borrows, a person repays, and the matter ends. But when the Mafia put cash on the street, a debt was a leash, not a number. A skimming collector was hung on a meat hook for 3 days. A debtor was burned in a basement while a banquet went on upstairs. In the end, these were the debts collected in blood. Section 1. Sam DiStefano. The West Side of Chicago, in the years after the war, was a place where a man could borrow money without ever setting foot in a bank. And for a certain kind of borrower, that was the only kind of loan available. The gambler who had run through his wages, the small businessman a bank had turned away, the hold-up man who needed a stake for one more job, the addict who needed anything at all. None of these people could walk into a lending office and come out with cash. But there was a man in Little Italy who would lend to anyone, who in fact preferred the borrowers everyone else refused, and that preference was the first sign that something was very wrong with him. His name was Samuel DiStefano, and in a criminal world full of hard and frightening men, he was the one the other hard men were afraid of. He was born in September of 1909, one of the children of Italian immigrants who had come to the United States in 1903, and he grew up in the tight, poor streets of the West Side. His descent into crime began early, and it began ugly. In 1927, at 18 years old, he was convicted of the rape of a teenage girl, part of a group assault, and sent to prison for 3 years, a sentence lighter than that of his co-defendant. It was, as things turned out, a fitting overture to the life that followed, because the thing that would define DiStefano was never simply money, it was cruelty. The money was the reason the outfit kept him around. The cruelty was the reason his name still turns up on lists of the worst men the American underworld ever produced. After that first prison term, he fell in with the 42 gang, the notorious West Side street crew that served as a kind of farm team for the Chicago outfit, the same gang that produced future bosses like Sam Giancana and Tony Accardo. He moved into bootlegging and gambling and robbery, and the robberies kept sending him back to prison. In 1932, he was shot and wounded by a policeman during the holdup of a grocery store, and turned up afterward at a West Side hospital with bullet wounds he refused to explain. The next year, he was convicted of robbing a bank in New Lisbon, Wisconsin, a job that fell apart when the getaway car broke down, and DiStefano was caught climbing a tree to escape into the woods. He drew a long sentence and served roughly 11 years, getting out in 1944. 3 years after that, he was back inside again, this time at Leavenworth, for selling counterfeit sugar ration stamps. And it was there, in the federal penitentiary, that he made the connections that would shape the rest of his life. He met the outfit heavyweights Paul Ricca and Louis Campagna, men near the top of the Chicago organization, and those relationships would later open the door to the racket that made him rich. When he came out, he did something that reveals how carefully he could think when it suited him. He took a job with the city of Chicago as a foreman at a garbage dump, a legitimate civil service position, lying on the application about his criminal past. When city officials discovered the lie in 1952, they chose not to prosecute him, and the episode is worth pausing on, because it shows that DiStefano understood from early on the value of a respectable front and the reach of political protection. He was not just a thug, he was a thug who bought judges. In the early 1950s, using money left over from his robbery days, he began investing in Chicago real estate, buying a large apartment building, and using the rent as a clean, explainable income. That clean money then went to work in the dirtiest way possible. He spread it among aldermen, judges, and police officers, building a network of paid officials so extensive that he could boast, with some truth, that there was no case he could not fix. His fees for the service became almost a published price list, around $800 to make a robbery charge disappear, $1,500 for an assault, and on one occasion, by his own boast, $20,000 to fix a first-degree murder indictment. The fixing business fed directly into the business that came to define him, because of a single, poisonous piece of arithmetic that DiStefano understood better than almost anyone. His arrangements with corrupt police became so routine that officers would sometimes drive an arrested man straight to DiStefano's house. DiStefano would pay off the police, the charge would vanish, and the freed man would walk out owing DeStefano the money, which is to say, in the language of the Chicago underworld, he would be put on the juice. Juice was the local word for the interest on a loan shark debt, and once a man was on the juice, he was no longer a free man in any meaningful sense. He owed, and the debt grew, and the growing was the whole point. By the late 1950s, DeStefano had recognized where the real and lasting money was, and it was not in fixing cases or collecting rent. It was in lending. He became one of the most prominent loan sharks in Chicago, operating with his brother Mario, and with the approval of the outfit's leadership, and by the end of the following decade, he was charging 20 to 25% interest per week. That figure is worth reading slowly, because it is not an annual rate, it is a weekly one, an engine designed so that the principal could almost never be paid down, and the borrower could be milked indefinitely. His clientele ran the full range of Chicago society. Politicians and attorneys borrowed from him at the top, small-time crooks and gamblers at the bottom, and it was the small borrowers he found most profitable, because they had the least ability to pay and the fewest places to hide. One of his collectors later described how easy it was to find a man who went into hiding, because the man's own wife, exhausted and frightened, would so often give him up just to make the trouble stop. But the interest rates and the client list are the ordinary part of the story, the part shared by every loan shark in every city. What set DeStefano apart, what made even other outfit killers regard him as something diseased, was the way he chose his borrowers and the reason he chose them. He deliberately sought out the worst possible risks, the drug addicts and the men who had already defaulted on other people's loans, the people any rational lender would refuse. He did this not in spite of the fact that they would fail to pay, but precisely because they would. When a borrower could not pay, DeStefano was entitled, in his own mind, to punish him, and punishment was the thing DeStefano lived for. Other gangsters said he would foam at the mouth while working on a victim. He had built, in the basement of his home, a soundproofed chamber for exactly this purpose, a room fitted out for torture, and his preferred instrument was an ice pick. He would sometimes kill a debtor who owed him only a small sum, not because the sum mattered, but because the killing served as an advertisement to everyone else who owed him more. A dead man who owed a little made the living man who owed a lot pay on time. He was also, in his way, a careful killer. He would give some of his loan shark victims presents, a gold watch engraved with his own name on the back, so that if the victim later turned up dead and the police came asking, DeStefano could produce the watch as evidence of how close the two men had been, how impossible it was that he could have done such a thing to a friend. He wore thick black-rimmed glasses that led people to assume he was nearly blind without them, when in fact he saw everything and forgot nothing, taking silent, careful measure of everyone around him. The madness was real, but it was braided together with a cold and functioning cunning, and that combination was what made him so dangerous. A purely madman can be managed. A madman who plans is another thing entirely. The clearest window into what DeStefano actually did to the people who fell behind is the case of Peter Cappelletti, one of his own collectors. Cappelletti made the catastrophic error of skimming from the operation, keeping $25,000 he had collected from a loan shark victim, and fleeing Chicago for Wisconsin. This was theft, and it was theft from DeStefano, and there was only ever going to be one answer to it. DeStefano's men found Cappelletti and brought him back, and DeStefano chained him to a radiator and tortured him over a period of 3 days, using a blowtorch on his body. What makes the episode almost unbelievable is the staging of it. On the final day, DeStefano invited Cappelletti's own family to a banquet at a restaurant connected to the operation. While the meal went on in the front, Cappelletti was being tortured in the back, and at one point he was heard begging to be killed, crying that he was on fire. DeStefano's reply, by the accounts that survive, was that they would have to put the fire out, and he had his men drag the burned and broken Cappelletti out into the dining room in front of his relatives and forced the family to urinate on him together. After the banquet, the family paid back the $25,000. That was the function of the whole grotesque performance. It was a collection method. The horror was the receipt. The killing that finally caught up with him, though, grew out of a debt and an insult rather than a theft. In November of 1963, DeStefano had a violent argument with a man named Leo Foreman, a real estate agent who worked as one of DeStefano's juice loan collectors. In the course of the argument, in Foreman's own office, Foreman physically threw DeStefano out, and for a man like DeStefano, that humiliation could not be allowed to stand. He went into hiding for a time, and then his underlings went to work. Two of them, a young man named Tony Spilotro and another named Charles Cromaldi, approached Foreman with a friendly message, telling him that DeStefano wanted to let bygones be bygones, that the whole thing was forgotten. Foreman, reassured, allowed himself to be lured to a house belonging to DeStefano's brother. There he was taken to a basement and set upon, beaten over the head and knees with a hammer, brutalized for hours before DeStefano himself even arrived. When DeStefano finally came down into the basement, according to Cromaldi, who later turned government witness and described the scene, DeStefano screamed at the dying man that he had told him he would get him, that greed had gotten him killed. He stabbed Foreman repeatedly with an ice pick and shot him in the buttocks rather than in any vital place, so as to prolong the suffering, and watched him bleed. Foreman's body, carrying more than 100 wounds, was later found in the trunk of a car. Another of DeStefano's known victims was Arthur Adler, a local restaurant owner who had fallen behind on his loan shark payments and was tortured and killed. When the celebrated FBI agent William Romer first came to DeStefano's home to ask about the Adler killing, DeStefano answered the door in pajamas with himself exposed, then summoned his wife and children and their friends, and screamed a theatrical curse at them, calling on God to strike them with cancer if he were guilty. This was the performance he gave the authorities for years, and it worked, in the sense that it kept him out of a courtroom he could not talk his way out of. Romer, who spent much of his career chasing the outfit, came away regarding DeStefano as the worst torture murderer in the history of the country, a judgment shared by others who dealt with him. In the end, it was DeStefano's own performances that killed him, though not at the hands of the law. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, the courtroom theatrics grew more extreme. He demanded to represent himself, arrived dressed in pajamas, was wheeled in on a stretcher, and shouted through a bullhorn, rambling and disruptive. For a time, this circus served him, sowing enough confusion to help him escape conviction. But when he and his crew, including Spilotro and his brother Mario, were finally indicted for the murder of Leo Foreman, the outfit's leadership looked at DeStefano's behavior and saw not a clever defense, but a mortal threat. A man that unstable, that hungry for the spotlight, would not only sink his own case but drag his co-defendants down with him, and among those co-defendants was Spilotro, in whom the outfit had a growing investment. In a secret meeting, the outfit's leadership gave the crew permission to remove the problem. On the 14th of April 1973, DeStefano went to the garage of his home on the northwest side, expecting a meeting with his brother and Spilotro about the case. Someone stepped into the garage and fired a shotgun into him from close range, one blast tearing into his chest and another ripping his left arm off at the elbow, killing him where he stood. No one was ever tried for it. The man who had built a soundproof room so that no one would hear his victims was himself killed quietly in a garage, disposed of by the same organization that had used him for years. There is a bitter symmetry in how the story ends, and it points at the truth that runs underneath the whole grim account. Mad Sam DeStefano was, for 2 decades, the sharpest possible expression of what the juice loan actually was. He understood that the debt was never really about the money. The money was the hook, the interest was the leash, and the violence was the entire purpose of the arrangement, the thing that made the whole machine turn. He lent to people who could not pay, because their failure gave him license to do the thing he most wanted to do, and he killed the ones who owed a little to make sure the ones who owed a lot were too frightened to fall behind. He turned a basement into a place of business, and a family banquet into an instrument of collection. And when his usefulness finally ran out, the men above him applied the same logic to him that he had applied to Peter Capoletti and Leo Foreman. He had become a liability, and liabilities, in that world, are not managed. They are collected. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case stays in Chicago, but turns from the loan shark to the man who collected for him. A 300-pound outfit juice collector was suspected of skimming the take and talking to the FBI, and he was taken to a meat rendering plant on the south side, hung alive on a hook, and worked on for 3 days. Section 2. William Action Jackson. The word for a debt collector in the Chicago underworld was juice man, and the word for the money he squeezed out of people was juice. And if a collector was very good at his work, very reliable, the sort of man who always came back with what he had been sent to get, the street had a nickname for that too. They called him Action. That was where William Jackson got the name that would follow him into the history books. Action Jackson, a name that sounded almost cheerful, almost like a compliment, and in a sense it was. It meant he produced. It meant that when a man fell behind on a juice loan and Action Jackson came around, the money got paid. What the name did not capture, what nothing about the man's fearsome size and reputation could have predicted, was that the most feared collector in the outfit stable would himself become the most horrifying collection in the whole history of the American mob, worked over for days by the very organization he had served so faithfully, for a debt he almost certainly never owed. Jackson was born in December of 1920, and he grew into an enormous man, well over 300 pounds, a giant by the standards of any room he walked into. The Chicago police, who knew him for years, described him in a line that has followed him ever since, saying he had the body of a giant and the brain of a child. It was a cruel description, but it pointed at something real about how the underworld used him. He was muscle. He was a physical presence, a wall of a man whose mere arrival at a delinquent borrower's door was usually argument enough. His criminal record stretched back 2 decades. In 1941, he was arrested in Green Bay, Wisconsin, for assault and robbery. In 1947, he was charged with rape and beat the case. In 1949, he was convicted of robbery and sentenced to 4 to 8 years. And after his parole in 1953, he came back to Chicago and went to work as a strong-arm man for the gangsters who ran the city's rackets. By the early 1960s, he had settled into his role as a juice collector, a man who specialized, in the words of one account, in pain for delinquent customers. He worked collecting for the outfit's loan shark operations, and by several accounts, one of the men he collected for was Sam DeStefano. To understand what happened to Action Jackson, it helps to understand exactly where a juice collector sat in the machine. The loan shark at the top put money on the street. The interest, the juice, came due every week, and it came due whether the borrower had eaten that week or not. But the loan shark himself rarely went knocking on doors. That work was dangerous, exposing, and beneath him, it was handed down to men like Jackson, who carried the cash back up the chain and took a cut for the labor. The collector was the point where the whole abstract arrangement, the loan and the interest and the compounding debt, turned into something physical, a fist on a door, a hand on a collar, a frightened man emptying his pockets on a kitchen table. The collector was trusted with other people's money on a daily basis, moving sums of cash back and forth with no receipts and no records, and that trust was the foundation of his position. It was also, as Jackson would discover, the thing that could destroy him, because a man trusted with untraceable cash is a man who can be suspected, at any moment and on no evidence at all, of keeping some of it for himself. The chain of events that killed him began, as so many of these stories do, with the attention of the federal government. In 1960, the celebrated FBI agent William Romer, who spent his career trying to break the Chicago outfit, approached Jackson and asked him to become an informant, to tell the Bureau what he knew about the organization he served. Jackson, a loyal man, declined. He would not turn. And for a while that was the end of it, a conversation that led nowhere, an offer refused. But the underworld is a place where suspicion does not require proof, where the mere fact of having been approached can be as damning as having said yes. The seed had been planted, whether Jackson knew it or not. Somewhere in the outfit, the question had been asked. Was Action Jackson talking? The following year, the question grew teeth. In 1961, Jackson was arrested along with 5 other men at a warehouse, caught unloading some $70,000 worth of electrical appliances from a stolen truck. There is a small, grim detail in the accounts of that arrest that captures the man. When the agents closed in, the other 5 tried to run. Jackson did not run because he was too heavy to run, and so he simply stood there and was taken. In the course of that arrest and its aftermath, the authorities learned, and it became known, that Jackson was a juice collector. And in the paranoid arithmetic of the outfit, the pieces now formed a pattern that looked like betrayal. He had been asked to inform. He had been arrested. Perhaps, some began to whisper, he had made a deal. Perhaps the giant with the brain of a child had been talking to the FBI all along, or was being squeezed by the mounting charges into talking now. On top of that suspicion ran a parallel one, an accusation that Jackson had been skimming, holding back some of the money he collected, stealing from the organization he served. Either charge, the informing, or the skimming, was a death sentence. Together, they were beyond appeal. There was, it should be said, a further and murkier possibility that has floated through the accounts over the years. A suggestion by some outfit insiders that Jackson was killed not for informing or skimming at all, but for having raped the wife of a mob-connected man who was in prison at the time. It is impossible now to weigh these explanations against one another with any confidence. What is certain is that the outfit decided Action Jackson had to die, and that they decided he should not die quickly. The men who took him wanted, above all, to make him talk, to force a confession out of him about the informing and the stealing. And beyond that, they wanted to make an example so terrible that no other collector would ever be tempted to do what they suspected Jackson had done. Sometime around the start of August 1961, Jackson was taken. The men who did it, by the various accounts, took him at gunpoint to a meat rendering plant on the south side of Chicago, an industrial slaughterhouse of a place, and there they went to work on him in a manner so extreme that it has been called one of the most brutal gangland killings in American history, a benchmark against which other atrocities are still measured. What was done to him in that plant is difficult to set down, and this account will not linger over it beyond what is necessary to understand the cruelty of it and the purpose behind it. They stripped him. They hung his enormous body in the air on a meat hook, impaled through the body so that he dangled off the ground. They smashed his knees. They broke his ribs. They shot him. They burned him with a blowtorch and shocked him with an electric cattle prod. And through all of it they questioned him, demanding that he confess to being an informer, and they threatened, by some accounts, to do the same to his wife and children if he did not admit what he had done. Jackson, through all of it, insisted he was not a rat. His torturers did not believe him. And then, the most chilling detail of the entire episode, they simply left him there, hanging, and let the process finish on its own. He did not die under a single killing blow. He died slowly, over roughly 3 days, of shock and internal injury, and sheer exhaustion of the body, alone in an industrial building, his death an afterthought to the torture that had been the real event. His body was found on the 12th of August, 1961, stuffed into the trunk of his own car, a green Cadillac convertible, abandoned on Lower Wacker Drive in the heart of downtown Chicago. When the police opened the trunk, they found the nearly naked body of the giant, face forward, with rope marks on his wrists and ankles, cuts and burns across his flesh, his chest crushed, the marks of the hook and the prod and the torch all over him. There was no attempt at concealment, no elaborate burial, no dissolving of the body that the outfit was capable of arranging. He was simply left in his own car in a public place, and that too was part of the message. The point was not to make Action Jackson disappear. The point was for people to know, in whispers, exactly what had happened to him, and exactly why, so that the fear of it would settle over every other collector and every other man who might ever think of talking to the FBI or holding back $1. That the message was received, and received widely, is one of the strangest and most telling parts of the story. In the aftermath, the FBI's listening devices, planted in the places where the outfit's men gathered and spoke freely, captured mobsters discussing the Jackson killing among themselves. Some of the men involved were heard recounting the details, and there was even said to be a set of photographs of Jackson's tortured body that circulated among outfit members, passed hand to hand for the express purpose of keeping order and spreading fear. The killing had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had become a legend inside the organization, a story every wise guy knew, a permanent reminder of the price of betrayal. And there is a final, bitter irony buried in those overheard conversations, because it was through them, through the mobsters bragging and reminiscing about what they had done to Action Jackson, that federal agents came to understand the full horror of the case. The very cruelty that was supposed to enforce silence became, in the end, a source of intelligence. The killers convicting themselves in their own words for a machine they did not know was listening. There is one more layer to the tragedy, and it is the layer that makes the Jackson case linger. According to those who studied the outfit most closely, Action Jackson very likely was not an informer at all. The offer from Romer had been made, and refused. The suspicion that grew afterward was built on circumstance and rumor, on the fact of an arrest and the general paranoia of an organization that trusted no one. A man was tortured to death over 3 days, hung on a hook in a slaughterhouse, for a crime the evidence suggests he never committed. And even the alternate theory, that he was killed over the imprisoned man's wife, would mean the same thing in the end, that the elaborate interrogation, the demands for a confession to informing, were beside the point, that the machinery of debt collection cruelty was simply turned on a man for reasons that had nothing to do with any debt at all. That is the deepest lesson of the Action Jackson killing, and the reason it belongs in any honest account of how the mob collected what it was owed. The collector and the collected were never really separate categories. They were the same man at different moments. Jackson had spent years being the fist at the door, the enormous frightening presence who made other men pay, and the whole time he did it, he was subject to exactly the same logic. The logic that says a debt is a leash, and the failure to account for every dollar is a capital offense. When the organization decided he owed something, whether money he had skimmed or loyalty he had supposedly betrayed, it did not send him a fist at the door. It sent him to the meat hook. The man whose nickname meant he always produced was made, at the end, to produce a confession he did not have, and when he could not, he was left to die in the dark. One more debt settled the only way the outfit knew how to settle anything. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves from Chicago to Brooklyn, to a quiet bar on Flatlands Avenue where a Gambino crew turned loan collection into an assembly line of death. A crew member who had fallen deep into debt and was thought to be weakening was lured into a back apartment, and what was done to him there became the model for as many as 200 killings. Section 3. Roy DeMeo. On Flatlands Avenue in the Canarsie section of Brooklyn, there was a neighborhood bar called the Gemini Lounge, an ordinary-looking place where off-duty cops and college students and small-time hustlers came to drink through the 1960s and 1970s. It had a side entrance that led into an apartment attached to the building, and the apartment was rented by a crew member the others called Dracula. To the men who used it, the arrangement seemed unremarkable, a bar with a flat next door. But that side door was one of the most dangerous thresholds in the history of American organized crime, because a great many men who walked through it were never seen again in any recognizable form. The bar and the apartment behind it were the workshop of a Gambino crew whose specialty was making people vanish, and the man who ran it had learned his trade, quite literally, behind a meat counter. His name was Roy DeMeo, and he had come to the killing business the way he had come to everything else, through the collection of a debt. DeMeo was born in 1940 and grew up in Brooklyn, in a working-class Italian family, and his descent into crime began earlier and more ordinarily than almost anyone's. While he was still a teenager at James Madison High School, he ran a small loan sharking operation among his own classmates. The story of how it worked is almost mundane in its logic. He held a job as a delivery boy, and being industrious, he made twice the trips of the other kids and earned twice the money, roughly $100 a week. And once he had cash in hand, he began lending it out to the other boys. If they did not pay him back, he beat them. That was the entire model, in miniature, of the life that followed. Lend money, charge interest, and enforce the debt with violence. It was so profitable that he quit the delivery job to lend money full-time, and by the time he was approaching 20, he had made enough of a name that older and far more dangerous men began to notice him. Alongside the loan sharking, DeMeo took a job that would give his later crimes their signature horror. He worked as an apprentice in the butcher section of a local supermarket, where he learned how to break down an animal carcass, how to cut a body into manageable pieces and wrap them for the counter. He graduated from high school in 1959, and to the neighborhood he looked like a young man trying to make an honest start, a butcher with a trade. Underneath, he was a loan shark with ambitions, and the two skills, the lending and the cutting, would eventually merge into something monstrous. The man who recognized DeMeo's potential was a Gambino soldier named Anthony Gaggi, known as Nino, whom DeMeo met around 1966. The introduction, fittingly, came through a debt. The owner of a lounge DeMeo frequented was a heavy gambler who fell into debt to DeMeo, and DeMeo became a silent partner in the bar as a result, later renaming it the Gemini Lounge. Gaggi watched how well the young man ran his money operation, and made him the offer that pulled him fully into the orbit of the Gambino family. He told DeMeo that he could make far more money working with the Gambinos than working alone. DeMeo accepted, and the two men set up a loan sharking partnership together, making juice loans as partners, kicking a share of the profits up to Gaggi and, through him, up the Gambino chain of command. It was the classic arrangement, the same one that structured every operation in this account. The money went out on the street, the interest came back, and a percentage of it flowed upward to the men above. From that base, DeMeo built outward with relentless energy. He assembled a crew of young neighborhood men, among them Chris Rosenberg, a drug dealer he had met and bankrolled at a Canarsie gas station, and later the pair known as the Gemini twins, Anthony Center and Joseph Testa, along with his cousin Joseph Guglielmo, the man they called Dracula, who lived in the apartment behind the bar. The crew moved into stolen cars, running a sophisticated auto theft ring, into hijacking trucks, into drugs, and into pornography. And to launder the proceeds, DeMeo did something clever. In 1972, he got himself onto the board of a Brooklyn credit union, and used his position there both to wash dirty money and to funnel cash out of the institution to enlarge his loan sharking book. His roster of loan customers grew from car dealerships to a whole cross-section of the borough, doctors and lawyers, restaurants, flea markets, an abortion clinic, anyone who needed money and could not get it clean. By his early 30s, he was living in a custom-built home on Long Island, with a wife and 3 children, telling his neighbors he was in construction and the used car business. The turn from loan shark to killer came, as it so often did, through the fear of an informer. DeMeo and Gaggi were silent partners in an illegal pornography operation, and when the police raided the lab in the early 1970s, the proprietor, a man named Paul Rothenberg, was arrested, and Gaggi became convinced he would crack and talk. Rothenberg had in fact told the police he was being extorted by silent partners. DeMeo was given the job of removing the problem. He lured Rothenberg to a diner, then pulled him into a nearby alley and shot him twice in the head. Informants later said, DeMeo remarked afterward how surprisingly easy it had been, that he had come to see murder as simply business, and that once a man had done such a thing, he could do anything. That killing, the first, was the hinge on which his whole life turned, and it was later the very murder Gaggi used to justify DeMeo's eventual formal induction into the Gambino family. The method that made the crew infamous was refined out of an early mistake, and that mistake also grew out of the world of debts and betrayals. In the mid-1970s, a young auto shop owner named Andre Katz, a partner in the crew's stolen car ring, fell out with DeMeo and went to the authorities, volunteering information about the crew's crimes. To DeMeo, this was betrayal, and there was only one answer. The crew lured Katz to an apartment under the pretense of a date with a woman, seized him, and killed him, then took his body to the butcher department of a supermarket and dismembered it, at one point putting his head into a compacting machine. The Katz killing was messy, and it led to arrests, though the men charged were acquitted, and from the errors of it, DeMeo drew a lesson. He designed a system. From then on, the crew would cut each body into roughly 6 pieces and scatter the packages, dumping many of them at a vast garbage landfill where tons of refuse arrived every day, and any single set of remains would be lost forever. The system acquired a name, the Gemini method, after the lounge, and its steps were described years later by crew members who turned government witness. The victim would be lured into the apartment behind the bar. As he stepped inside, someone, often DeMeo himself, would shoot him in the head with a silenced pistol, and immediately a towel would be wrapped around the wound to contain the blood. Then another crew member would stab the victim in the heart, a step with a cold physiological logic behind it, meant to stop the heart from pumping, and so to limit the bleeding while the body was moved to the bathroom. There the body was hung to drain, and then it was dismembered, wrapped, bagged, and taken away to disappear. DeMeo, the former butcher, ran it like a disassembly line, each man with his task, and he was said to be a perfectionist about it. The crew came to the lounge almost daily, drinking and planning and gossiping, like any group of colleagues, in a place that was, when the work required it, a slaughterhouse for human beings. Over the decade of its operation, the crew is believed to have killed somewhere between 75 and 200 people, a toll that likely exceeds the infamous Murder Incorporated of an earlier era, with DeMeo himself thought to have personally killed dozens. The killing that belongs most squarely in an account of debt collection, though, is the one the crew turned inward, against one of their own. Edward Grillo, known as Danny, was a hijacker who had joined the crew after a prison stretch and worked alongside DeMeo on truck robberies and other schemes. But Grillo fell into heavy debt, owing DeMeo a great deal of money he could not repay, and a man who owes his own crew and cannot pay is a man under enormous pressure, the kind of pressure that can make a person start thinking about a deal with the law to escape it. DeMeo and Gaggy came to believe that Grillo had grown weak, that the weight of his debt was making him a candidate to run to the authorities for protection. In November of 1978, Grillo was killed, and his body was dismembered and disposed of like so many others. It was, by the accounts of the crew, the first time DeMeo turned the machinery of murder on a member of his own organization as a matter of internal discipline, and the reason, at bottom, was a debt. Grillo owed money he could not pay, and in the arithmetic of that world, a debtor who cannot pay and might crack is not a problem to be managed, but a liability to be erased. The man who had spent his life collecting from debtors was, in the end, brought down inside his own crew by the same principle. His debt to DeMeo transformed seamlessly into a reason to kill him. The rest of DeMeo's story is a study in how the very ruthlessness that made him valuable eventually made him too dangerous to keep alive, the same pattern that ran through the lives of Sam DeStefano and Action Jackson. He continued to deal drugs after being ordered to stop and continued to kill without seeking permission. When his second-in-command, Chris Rosenberg, botched a drug deal by murdering men connected to a Cuban cartel, raising the threat of open war, DeMeo was ordered to kill his own protege, and after weeks of stalling he did, though the killing shook him badly. In the paranoia of those weeks, he made his most notorious error, gunning down an 18-year-old college student named Dominic Ragucci, a door-to-door salesman he mistook for a cartel assassin sitting outside his home. By his son's account, DeMeo wept when he learned he had killed an innocent boy. By the early 1980s, the FBI was closing in, drawn by the sheer number of people who had last been seen entering the Gemini Lounge. Informants inside the crew began to talk, and the Gambino leadership came to see DeMeo the way every organization in these stories eventually comes to see its most useful killer, as a catastrophic liability whose knowledge and instability threatened everyone above him. Boss Paul Castellano wanted him dead, but the contract proved almost impossible to place because DeMeo was surrounded by an army of killers and no one wanted the job. John Gotti was said to have passed on it. In the end, it fell to men close to DeMeo himself. On the 10th of January 1983, DeMeo went to a meeting expecting ordinary business and never came home. Roughly 10 days later, his body was found in the trunk of his own Cadillac, abandoned at a Brooklyn boat club, shot several times, the remains partly frozen by the winter cold. The man who had made so many bodies disappear was left, like Action Jackson before him, in the trunk of a car for the world to find. There is a grim completeness to the arc of it. Roy DeMeo began as a teenager beating classmates who could not repay small loans, and ended as the master of an industrial killing operation, and the line between those 2 points was perfectly straight. Every stage of his rise was built on the same foundation: the loan and the interest and the violence that enforced them, and the credit union and the car ring and the drugs were all just larger vessels for the same basic act. When he needed a way to dispose of the people that business produced, the debtors who could not pay, and the partners who might talk, he reached back to the trade he had learned at the meat counter and built a system around it. And when the organization above him finally decided that DeMeo himself had become a debt that could not be carried, they collected on him in the only currency the whole enterprise had ever really dealt in: the butcher of Flatlands Avenue, who had turned so many men into packages, was himself made to disappear into the trunk of a car in the Brooklyn cold. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case leaves the streets of Brooklyn for the neon of the Las Vegas Strip, where the Chicago outfit sent a small, cold-eyed enforcer to guard the millions being skimmed from the casino counting rooms. He ran his own crew, his own loan book, and his own rules, and a con man, who owed a debt tied to a casino scam, was shot dead in his own home to settle it. Section 4. Anthony Spilotro. Las Vegas, in the 1970s, was a city built on a river of money that moved in the dark. The mob-controlled casinos on the Strip took in cash by the truckload, and a portion of that cash, the untaxed, unrecorded portion, was lifted out of the counting rooms before it was ever written down and carried back to the men who really owned the places, the crime families of Chicago and the Midwest. That stolen river was called the Skim, and it was the beating heart of the mob's presence in the desert. Guarding it, keeping the whole delicate arrangement running smoothly, and making sure no one interfered with the flow, required a particular kind of man, someone who could apply violence and the threat of violence with total reliability. The Chicago outfit sent one of the most feared enforcers it had ever produced, a small, cold-eyed man who stood barely over 5 feet tall and who ran the streets of Las Vegas for a decade and a half. His name was Anthony Spilotro, and the underworld called him Tony the Ant. Spilotro was born in Chicago in 1938, one of 6 brothers who grew up around a family restaurant that doubled as a hangout for local mobsters. He dropped out of school and started his criminal life young, alongside a boyhood friend named Frank Collada, the two of them beginning as rival shoeshine boys, before discovering their fathers had known each other and falling into a lifelong partnership of theft and burglary and worse. Spilotro understood early the 2 things that got a young man noticed by the outfit's bosses: the ability to earn and the willingness to kill without hesitation, and he made himself expert at both. He once told Collada that one day he would be boss of the outfit. He rose through the ranks as an enforcer, a man whose few quiet words could stop people in their tracks, and by the early 1960s, he had made his bones. His nickname came from the celebrated FBI agent William Romer, who publicly called him a little pissant, a phrase the newspapers could not print, so they shortened it to the Ant, and it stuck. His apprenticeship in cruelty had come, fittingly, under a man already in this account. In his early years, Spilotro was an associate of Sam DeStefano, and he was one of the underlings who lured Leo Foreman to the basement, where DeStefano tortured the man to death, and who was later suspected of involvement in the killings of both Foreman and, eventually, DeStefano himself. He learned the business of enforcement from the worst possible teacher, and he learned it well. In 1971, the outfit sent Spilotro west to Las Vegas to protect its interests. On the surface, his job was to keep the man running the mob's casinos, Frank Rosenthal, safe and the skim flowing, and to serve as the organization's muscle in the city. The arrangement between the outfit and a man like Spilotro was itself a kind of debt relationship, and it is worth understanding because it explains everything that followed. The outfit did not pay Spilotro a salary. Instead, it granted him what amounted to a franchise, a license to operate his own rackets in Las Vegas under the protection of the outfit's name. And in exchange, Spilotro was expected to keep the skim safe and to kick a percentage of everything he earned back up to Chicago. In effect, he owed a street tax to the men above him, and he in turn imposed a street tax on everyone below him. Every bookmaker, every drug dealer, every independent thief operating in his territory was expected to pay tribute for the privilege, and the ones who refused, or who could not, discovered exactly what Tony the Ant's reputation was built on. Rather than stay quietly in the background, which was what the outfit wanted, Spilotro built an empire of his own. He grew bored with simply guarding the skim, and he set about exporting to the desert every racket he had known in Chicago. He ran loan sharking. He fenced stolen goods out of a jewelry store he opened as a front, called the Gold Rush, and he assembled a crew of experienced thieves and safecrackers who became known as the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang, named for their method of breaking into buildings by drilling straight through the walls and ceilings to bypass the alarms on the doors and windows. In 1979, he summoned his old friend Frank Culotta from Chicago to serve as his lieutenant and to run the burglary crew. And beyond the thieving, Culotta and the crew served as Spilotro's enforcers, shaking down bookies and drug dealers who owed and carrying out the killings when killing was required. It was in that role, the collection of a debt owed by a man who had become dangerous, that the crew committed the murder that belongs at the center of this account. The victim was a con man named Sherwin Lisner, known as Jerry. Lisner was an associate who had gotten himself entangled with Culotta in a fraud scheme, a money exchange scam that lured Las Vegas businessmen into a swindle, and he had come to Culotta wanting protection in the operation. But Lisner got himself indicted, and word reached Spilotro through the underworld grapevine that Lisner was going to testify before a grand jury about the scheme and about the men behind it, namely Spilotro and Culotta. In the economy of that world, an associate who is going to talk is the most dangerous debt of all, because what he owes is silence, and he is about to default on it. When Spilotro heard the news, he turned to Culotta and told him, in effect, that he knew what had to be done now. On the night of the 10th of October 1979, Culotta went to Lisner's home on the west side of Las Vegas. Lisner was alone. Culotta entered and shot him several times in the head with a small caliber pistol, and then something happened that revealed how hard even a botched killing could be to finish. Lisner, shot repeatedly in the head, did not die. He rose and a struggle broke out through the house, the wounded man fighting for his life. Culotta later testified, in the flat language of a man recounting a job, that he shot him, and the man was still standing, so he shot him again. At one point, Culotta tried to strangle Lisner with the electrical cord from a water cooler, and the cord snapped. In the end, Lisner was killed, and his body was found the next morning floating face down in the swimming pool of his own home. A man had been executed in his own house to settle the debt of his threatened testimony, shot again and again because he would not die, and dumped in his own pool. The Lisner killing became, years later, one of the threads that unraveled Spilotro, and the way it did so illustrates the same fatal logic that governed every story in this account. The killing had been ordered by Spilotro, but by some accounts, he had not obtained the required permission from the bosses in Chicago before having it done, an act of freelancing that the outfit did not forgive. Spilotro's larger problem was that he had done exactly the opposite of what he had been sent to Las Vegas to do. He was supposed to operate in darkness, and instead he had made himself one of the most famous and most watched men in the state. He was blacklisted from the casinos he was meant to oversee, formally barred by the Nevada authorities from setting foot in them. He carried on an affair with the wife of Rosenthal, the man whose casinos he was there to protect, a serious breach of the underworld's own code. And his crew's crimes drew relentless federal and local attention that threatened the very skim he had been sent to guard. The end came, as it did for DeStefano and for DeMeo, when the organization decided that its most useful enforcer had become its most dangerous liability. The trigger was betrayal from within. In 1981, the Hole-in-the-Wall gang's attempt to burglarize a Las Vegas store called Bertha's ended in a police ambush and the arrest of much of the crew because one of its members had become an informer. Culotta himself was arrested, and in 1982, facing a long sentence and having learned through an FBI wiretap that Spilotro was heard talking about the need to clean his dirty laundry, which Culotta understood as a contract on his own life. Culotta did the thing that toppled the whole structure. He became a government witness. He admitted to involvement in more than 300 crimes, including 4 murders, and he testified that Spilotro had ordered the killing of Jerry Lisner and had ordered the luring of a victim to his death back in Chicago years before. The man who had done the muscle work turned on the man who had ordered it. Spilotro was indicted for the Lisner murder and for other crimes, but the cases against him did not hold. It was largely Collada's word against his, and he was acquitted. The law, in the end, could not finish him. His own organization did. In January of 1986, in the wake of the imprisonment of top outfit bosses for skimming the Las Vegas casinos, the leadership gathered and concluded that Spilotro's high-profile recklessness had exposed their rackets and cost them millions and their freedom. One of the bosses, blaming Spilotro for the prison sentence he now faced, called for his death, and the rest agreed. In June of 1986, Spilotro and his brother Michael were lured back to the Chicago area with the understanding that Michael was going to be made a member and Tony promoted to captain. The two men were suspicious, but they went. They were taken to the basement of a home in a Chicago suburb, and there they were beaten and strangled to death, and their bodies were driven out and buried in an Indiana cornfield, where a farmer found the grave 9 days later. The truth of it did not come out for more than 2 decades, until a landmark federal trial in 2007 finally exposed what had happened. There is a clean and terrible consistency to the arc of Tony Spilotro, and it is the same consistency that runs through the men who came before him. He spent his career as the instrument through which the outfit collected what it was owed, the enforcer who made bookies and dealers pay their tribute, and who killed the con man Jerry Lisner in his own home to collect the debt of his silence. He lived inside a web of obligations, owing tribute to the men above him, and extracting it from the men below, and for a long time he was very good at making the numbers add up. But the whole system rested on a single unforgiving rule, that a man who becomes a liability is a debt the organization will not carry, and in the end, Spilotro violated that rule more flagrantly than anyone. He drew the heat that threatened the skim, he broke the code, he cost the bosses their fortune and their freedom. And so the men he had served applied to him the exact logic he had spent 15 years applying to others. He had become a debt, and they collected, in a basement, with their fists, and left him in the ground in a cornfield. The little enforcer who guarded the mob's money in the desert, erased by the same machine he had run. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves east, to the row houses of South Philadelphia, where a new boss took over the local mafia and imposed a tax on every criminal in the city. A well-connected bookmaker refused to keep paying it, and for that refusal he was first beaten nearly to death on a street corner, then, 4 years later, shot dead on another one. Section 5. Frank D'Alfonso. South Philadelphia, in the early 1980s, was a place of tight row-house streets and corner delicatessens, and a criminal order that had held steady for a generation. For 21 years, the local mafia had been run by a boss named Angelo Bruno, a man so committed to keeping the peace and staying out of the newspapers that he was known as the Gentle Don and the Docile Don. Bruno believed that quiet was good for business, that a low profile kept the police uninterested and the money flowing, and under him the independent criminals of the city, the bookmakers and loan sharks and number runners, were largely left to run their own rackets without interference. That world ended in March of 1980, when Bruno was shotgunned to death in his car, and the man who eventually clawed his way to the top of the wreckage that followed had a completely different philosophy. His name was Nicoduomo Scarfo, known as Little Nicky, and he believed that everyone who made $1 of criminal money in his city owed him a cut of it. The man who paid the price for insisting otherwise was a well-connected bookmaker named Frank D'Alfonso, whom everyone knew as Frankie Flowers. D'Alfonso was, by every account, an unlikely figure to become the most famous murder victim of the Scarfo era. He was not a made member of the Philadelphia Mafia. He was a long-time, low-key associate who had come up under Bruno, a man reported never to have killed anyone in his life. He owned a flower shop, which gave him his nickname, and he was a convicted gambler with deep and old ties to the Bruno organization, a bookmaker, and a fixture of the South Philadelphia underworld who had counted the old boss as a friend. He was, in the language of that world, a respected man, but he was respected in the way of the old order, the quiet order Bruno had built, and that was exactly the thing that would get him killed. Before his name became attached to a landmark murder case, few people outside the South Philadelphia underworld had ever heard of Frankie Flowers. He was a background figure, a man who had made his money quietly for decades and expected to go on doing so. The trouble began with the thing Scarfo introduced that the city's independent criminals had never really had to deal with under Bruno. Scarfo imposed what came to be called the street tax, a demand that every criminal operating in his territory, every drug dealer and bookmaker and loan shark and number runner working independently of the Mafia, pay him a cut, a weekly tribute, for the privilege of doing business on ground he claimed as his own. Extorting other criminals is a common enough Mafia racket, but in Philadelphia, it was something close to an alien practice, a break from the way Bruno had always operated, and it did not sit well with men who had spent their whole careers paying no one. The rule that came with it was simple and absolute. Those who paid were left alone. Those who refused were often killed. Scarfo backed the tax with a level of violence the city had not seen, ordering more than 20 murders in the space of a few years, killing enemies and friends alike, until the whole organization ran on fear. D'Alfonso resisted. He would not simply hand over a share of what he earned to a man he did not respect, a man who represented the crude and greedy new order that had displaced the world he had known under Bruno. And it must be said that the full picture of Scarfo's hatred for D'Alfonso ran deeper than money alone. In the years after Bruno's murder, D'Alfonso had received a certain amount of public attention, press coverage that suggested he had become, or was becoming, the real power in the Philadelphia family, that he was in some sense the new boss. This was not even true, but the mere suggestion of it enraged Scarfo, who had fought and killed his way to the top and could not tolerate the idea that a man who was not even a made member was being spoken of in the newspapers as the head of the family. So the grievance was tangled, part unpaid tribute and part wounded vanity, but at its core, it was the classic conflict of the street tax. A man was making money in Scarfo's city, and Scarfo believed that money, and the respect that came with it, belonged to him. The first collection came in October of 1981, and it was a beating meant to break D'Alfonso's will without killing him. By the accounts that later emerged, Scarfo had initially wanted D'Alfonso dead outright, but under the counsel of the New York families, particularly the Genovese organization with which the Philadelphia family was closely aligned, he was persuaded to try persuasion first, to bring D'Alfonso into line, rather than simply eliminate him. When the persuasion failed, Scarfo ordered a message delivered in the only language he truly trusted. On a South Philadelphia street in late October of 1981, D'Alfonso was set upon and beaten nearly to death. The injuries were catastrophic. He suffered a fractured skull, a broken jaw, shattered facial bones and eye sockets, and a destroyed kneecap, wounds that required dozens of stitches and left him permanently marked. Among the men said to have administered the beating were the rising young Scarfo captain, Salvatore Testa, and another soldier, a beating carried out on the orders of the boss to force a bookmaker to pay. What happened next tells you everything about the code D'Alfonso lived by and the world he came from. When the police came to his hospital bedside and asked him what had happened, this man with a busted skull and a shattered jaw and a wrecked knee, this man who had just been beaten to within an inch of his life on a public street, looked at them and told them he had been hit by a car. He would not name his attackers. He would not cooperate. He absorbed the beating and kept the code of silence, the old omerta, even as it very nearly killed him. In the aftermath, he did make a partial payment, reportedly some $50,000, a sum that bought him a period of peace, but he did not become a regular, reliable payer of the street tax. He made the one payment under the pressure of a near-fatal beating, and then he stopped. He would not be a weekly tributary to Nicky Scarfo, and in Scarfo's Philadelphia, that was a debt that could only be settled one way. For 4 years the matter simmered. Then, in 1985, Scarfo decided to finish it. He sought and received permission from the New York families to have D'Alfonso killed, and he assembled a team for the job, using the murder as an initiation, a way for aspiring young men to earn their membership in the family by proving they would kill on command. Scarfo promised to formally induct several proposed members after they had killed D'Alfonso, making the murder a kind of blood price for entry into the Mafia itself. On the evening of the 23rd of July, 1985, D'Alfonso was walking near his home in South Philadelphia, in the neighborhood of the Italian Market, and he stopped on a corner outside a delicatessen to talk to its owner and, by some accounts, to light a cigarette. There was a young boy nearby selling water ices from a cart on the sidewalk, and another boy was present as well. Gunmen approached and opened fire, shooting D'Alfonso at least 5 times, hitting him in the head and chest and shoulder and arm. He died there on the sidewalk. One of the boys received minor powder burns from the gunfire as he fled, and then hid behind his water ice cart for several minutes before running. Robbery was immediately ruled out as a motive, because $1,300 was found on D'Alfonso's body. This was not a robbery. It was a collection, the final one, the settling of a debt that Scarfo had decided could no longer be carried on the books. The killing of Frankie Flowers might have joined the long list of unsolved Philadelphia mob murders, except that Scarfo's reign of violence and paranoia eventually turned his own men against him. Scarfo had killed too freely, betrayed too many of his own, and in the mid-1980s, several of his associates, fearing they were next, went to the federal government and agreed to testify. 2 of them in particular, mob defectors who had been close to the operation, helped authorities solve 24 homicides and provided the inside testimony that finally made a murder charge stick against the boss himself. In 1989, Scarfo and 7 co-defendants were convicted in state court of the first-degree murder of Frank D'Alfonso. The conviction was historic. The federal authorities hailed Scarfo as the first La Cosa Nostra boss ever to be convicted of first-degree murder in an American court, a milestone in the long war against the Mafia, and Scarfo, who had already been convicted separately on sweeping federal racketeering charges involving many murders, was sentenced to life. The bookmaker who had refused to pay had, in death, helped achieve something no prosecutor had managed before: the murder conviction of a sitting Mafia boss. The legal story did not end cleanly, and honesty requires stating that plainly. The 1989 convictions in the D'Alfonso case were later overturned on appeal, and at a second trial the defendants were acquitted of that particular murder. One of the men convicted in the original trial, Joseph Legambi, who by some accounts had done the actual shooting and been formally initiated into the family as a reward, served about a decade in prison before winning acquittal at the retrial and going on, years later, to lead the Philadelphia family himself. So the specific murder conviction that had made history did not survive, a reminder of how difficult these cases are to hold together over time. But it changed nothing about the underlying facts of what had happened, and it changed nothing about the mountain of other convictions that buried Scarfo. He remained in prison for the rest of his life on the federal racketeering case, which had found him guilty of participating directly in numerous killings, and he died behind bars in 2017 at the age of 87, decades after the sidewalk killing of Frankie Flowers. What makes the D'Alfonso case matter, and what places it squarely in this account, is the pure and undisguised logic of it. There was no drug deal gone wrong here, no cartel debt, no missing shipment, no complicated betrayal. There was a bookmaker who made money in a city, and a boss who demanded a cut of that money, and a bookmaker who would not keep paying it. That was the entire dispute. The street tax was a debt that Scarfo invented and imposed by force, a tribute owed for nothing more than the right to exist as a criminal in his territory, and when D'Alfonso refused to pay it in full, the collection proceeded exactly as it proceeded for every debtor in every story in this account. First came the beating, the message meant to frighten the debtor into compliance, the shattered skull and the ruined knee that D'Alfonso absorbed in silence. And when the beating did not produce steady payment, when D'Alfonso made his one forced installment and then closed his wallet, the final collection came on a summer evening on a street corner. 5 bullets fired into a man who had stopped to light a cigarette. He was 55 years old, a low-key bookmaker who had wanted only to be left alone to run his rackets the old quiet way, and he was killed because in Nicky Scarfo's Philadelphia, there was no such thing as being left alone. There was only the tax, and the two ways of settling it, and Frankie Flowers had refused the first, so the second came for him on his own corner, near his own home, with the neighborhood children watching from behind a cart of flavored ice. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to the Bronx, and to a loan sharking operation so large that federal investigators called it the biggest such case they had ever built. Nearly 50 victims were caught in a web of loans at more than 200% a year, a debt trap designed so that the interest never stopped and the principal was never meant to be paid. Section 6. Dominic Capelli and Operation The Vig is Up. By the second decade of the 21st century, the American public had mostly filed the Mafia away as a thing of the past, a subject for films and museum exhibits. The old bosses dead or dying in prison, the great families broken by decades of federal prosecutions. But the machine that had powered the mob from the beginning was still turning, quietly, in the bars and smoke shops of the New York suburbs. And in 2018, the New York Attorney General's office pulled back the curtain on an operation that proved the oldest racket of all was not only alive but thriving. It was run by a made member of the Lucchese crime family named Dominic Capelli, and when the case was announced, the authorities called it the largest loan sharking operation the office had ever investigated. They gave the investigation a name that captured the whole grim comedy of the thing. They called it Operation The Vig is Up. The word vig, short for vigorish, is one of the defining terms of the loan shark trade, and understanding it is the key to understanding what Capelli's operation actually did. The vig is the interest, the weekly juice that a borrower pays simply for the privilege of owing money, and in a legitimate loan, the interest is part of a schedule that eventually retires the debt. In a loan shark loan, there is no such schedule. The vig is designed never to end. Capelli's operation, according to the investigators who spent roughly a year listening to it and watching it, charged interest rates that averaged more than 200% per year, and it structured the loans so that the weekly payments went entirely to interest, while the principal, the original sum borrowed, never came down at all. A man who borrowed money from Dominic Capelli was not taking out a loan in any ordinary sense. He was strapping himself to a wheel that would turn for the rest of his life, paying and never getting closer to being free, because the entire design of the thing was to keep him paying. The investigators had a phrase for it that cut to the heart of the matter. It was, they said, a high-cost debt trap, and everyone who took a loan fell into it. The operation was based in New Rochelle, just north of the Bronx, in Westchester County, and it ran on a model that had been perfected over the better part of a century. Capelli sat at the top as the made man, the figure whose Mafia membership gave the whole enterprise its menace and its backing, and he delegated the daily work to a structure beneath him, a super agent who managed the loan book and a manager who oversaw operations, with soldiers and associates handling the loans and the collections on the ground. It was, in miniature, the same pyramid that had structured every operation in this account, the same shape as DeStefano's juice racket in Chicago and DeMayo's loan book in Brooklyn, money flowing out to the street and interest flowing back up through the layers to the man at the top. The genius of it, if that word can be used, was that Capelli himself rarely needed to touch a borrower. The structure insulated him. The soldiers and associates did the collecting, and the debt did the rest. What made the operation so efficient, and what makes it such a clear illustration of how the modern racket works, was the way it fed itself. Capelli and his crew also ran an illegal gambling operation, a bookmaking business that took in more than $500,000 a year in wagers through a betting website. And the gambling and the loan sharking were not two separate businesses. They were two halves of a single machine, deliberately connected. The bookmaking operation generated a steady supply of gamblers, and gamblers, by their nature, lose. When a gambler lost more than he could pay, when he found himself owing a debt he could not cover, the operation had a solution ready for him. His bookie would refer him to the loan sharking side of the house, and the man who had just lost money he did not have would be offered the chance to borrow money he could not repay, at more than 200% a year, to cover the loss. In this way, the gambling operation functioned as a feeder, a funnel that caught desperate men at their most vulnerable moment and delivered them straight into the debt trap. The Attorney General described the scheme in exactly these terms, saying the ring used a gambling operation to funnel victims into their loan sharking operation and then saddled them with usurious payments. It was a closed loop, engineered to extract everything a man had and then to keep extracting. The collection of the VIG was handled with the mundane routine of any weekly business. The victims were required to make their high-interest payments every week, and they did so in one of two ways. Some paid the individual crew members directly, handing over cash to the men who came to collect. Others dropped their payments off at two ordinary-looking businesses in New Rochelle that served as the operation's collection points, a tavern and a smoke shop, walking in like any customer and leaving their weekly tribute. There is something particularly bleak about that image, the debtor trudging to a neighborhood bar or a vape shop week after week to hand over cash that would never reduce what he owed. The collection dressed up as an errand, the whole crushing arrangement folded into the ordinary texture of suburban life. No meat hooks here, no basements, no blowtorches. Just a man walking into a smoke shop with an envelope, because the debt trap of the modern loan shark does not always need the theater of violence. The threat is enough, and the threat is understood, because everyone involved knows what stands behind the friendly face of the collector. It is the Lucchese crime family, and everyone knows what that means. The scale of the harm becomes clear only when the numbers are laid out. Over the roughly 1-year period of the investigation alone, the operation took in more than $1 million in usurious interest payments, and investigators identified more than 47 distinct loan sharking victims, many of them carrying multiple loans at once, borrowing from one part of the operation to service another, sinking deeper with every week that passed. 47 people is not an abstraction. It is 47 households, 47 lives bent under the weight of a debt engineered never to end. 47 people who at some point made the decision, out of desperation or addiction or simple bad luck, to borrow money from men who had no intention of ever letting them stop paying. Many of them had come in through the gambling side, gamblers who lost and then borrowed, and then lost some more, caught in a machine that profited from every stage of their ruin. And these were only the victims investigators could identify in a single year of listening. The operation had been running longer than that, and the true toll, the full count of people who had passed through the debt trap over its life, was surely far larger. The case is a valuable one to set alongside the torture killings and street corner shootings that fill the rest of this account, because it shows the same underlying logic operating without the spectacular violence, and in some ways that makes it more revealing rather than less. The men who ran Operation The Vig Is Up did not need to hang anyone on a meat hook or dump anyone in a swimming pool, because the debt itself was the weapon. The 200% interest, the principal that never came down, the weekly grind of payments that led nowhere, these were the instruments of harm, and they did their work quietly, invisibly, on people who had no way out. The violence in a case like this is structural. It lives in the arithmetic. A man does not need to be beaten if he understands that the debt will follow him forever, and that the people he owes are members of a crime family, and so most of the collection can be done with nothing more than a weekly reminder and an envelope dropped at a bar. The thread of the beating hovers behind every transaction, unspoken and unnecessary, because the whole history of the Mafia, the De Stefanos and the De Mios, and all the rest, is the reason the threat does not have to be spoken. Bringing the operation down required an enormous investigative effort, precisely because the harm was so quiet, and the victims so reluctant to come forward. Men trapped in a debt to the Lucchese family do not, as a rule, call the police, both because they fear the consequences and because they are themselves involved in illegal gambling and illegal borrowing. So the authorities built the case from the outside, over the course of roughly a year, using the full toolkit of modern surveillance. They ran wiretaps, capturing the operation's communications. They used covert surveillance cameras and hidden cameras to watch the collection points. They planted a bug in a car. They deployed undercover officers. Piece by piece, from the recorded conversations and the watched drop-offs, they assembled the picture of the whole enterprise, the structure of it, the interest rates, the connection between the gambling and the lending, and the identities of the 47 victims. In March of 2018, they moved, arresting Capelli and 9 others, and charging them with enterprise corruption, with the underlying crimes of first-degree usury and first-degree promoting gambling, a top charge that carried a maximum penalty of more than 2 decades in prison. A related indictment charged additional men with running a separate online bookmaking operation, and another charged a man with drug offenses. The whole New Rochelle operation exposed and dismantled in a single day. The name the investigators chose, Operation The Vig Is Up, was a piece of gallows humor, a pun on the phrase "the jig is up," but it carried a real meaning too. For once, the vig, the endless interest that was the engine of the whole racket, had come to a stop. For the 47 people trapped in Capelli's debt machine, the arrests meant the weekly grind was finally, suddenly over. The wheel halted, the trap sprung open. It is worth pausing on what that must have meant to them, because the loan shark debt trap is a particular kind of prison, one with no release date built into it, one that ends only when the borrower dies or the operation is destroyed. For these people, the operation was destroyed, and the debt died with it. What Operation The Vig Is Up demonstrates, more clearly than almost any other case in this account, is that the fundamental crime of the Mafia loan shark has never really changed, only its packaging. The technology evolved, from the ledger in the head to the betting website, from the collector at the door to the cash dropped at a vape shop. The families weakened, their great bosses imprisoned, their old empires reduced. But the core racket, the loan that is designed never to be repaid, the interest that compounds into a life sentence, the gambling operation that manufactures the desperate borrowers the loan shark needs, all of it survived intact into the age of wiretaps and websites, running quietly in the New York suburbs, decades after everyone had declared the Mafia dead. The debt was still a leash, the vig was still the point, and 47 people in Westchester and the Bronx were still paying, week after week, at 200% a year, into a trap that would have held them for the rest of their lives, until one morning in March, the men who held the other end of the leash were led away in handcuffs, and the vig, at last, was up. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves back to Philadelphia, but to a different underworld than the one Nicky Scarfo ruled. In the basement of a neighborhood bar, a borrower who had fallen behind was made to lay his arm on a table, and a hatchet came down beside it, while the man who ran the operation explained what would happen to him if the money did not come. Section 7. Gyeli Gyeli and the Lion Bar. There is a persistent idea, comforting in its way, that the loan shark belongs to a vanished America, to the black and white world of fedoras and Cadillacs, and men named after neighborhoods. But the racket never died, and it was never confined to the Italian-American mafia that had made it famous. It simply passed into new hands, and one of the clearest proofs of that came out of the Mayfair section of Northeast Philadelphia, where an Albanian immigrant built a violent, multi-million-dollar loan sharking and gambling empire that ran for more than a decade out of the basement of a neighborhood bar. His name was Gyeli Gyeli, and though he was not a member of any Italian crime family, he understood the oldest lesson of the trade perfectly, and he traded on the reputation of the old families to enforce it. When a borrower fell behind, Gyeli did not send a letter. He invited the man down to the basement of his bar and showed him a hatchet. Gyeli, known to some as Willie, was among the Albanians who had come to the United States in the years after the collapse of Albania's communist regime in the early 1990s, part of a wave of immigrants building new lives in American cities. His chief lieutenant, Fatimir Mustafaraj, who went by Tony, was a former Albanian military police officer who became the muscle of the operation, the man whose job was to forcefully collect the debts owed to the organization. Together, from roughly the late 1990s through 2013, they built and ran a criminal enterprise with 2 intertwined sources of income, the same 2 that had powered mob operations for a century: loan sharking and illegal gambling. The scale of it was substantial. Federal investigators later established that in the 2 years before the arrests alone, from late 2011 to 2013, The enterprise extended 125 usurious loans, totaling roughly $1.75 million, and that the gambling side, an online sports betting operation, had generated more than $2.9 million in gross profits over several years. This was not a small neighborhood Shylock. It was a genuine multi-million-dollar operation. The interest rates Gielli charged tell the whole story of what kind of business this was. The annual rates on his loans ranged from 104% to 395%. At the high end, a borrower would owe nearly $4 in interest for every dollar he borrowed over the course of a year, a rate so steep that repayment in any ordinary sense was impossible. Like every operation in this account, the design was not to be repaid, but to keep the borrower paying, to trap him in a cycle of weekly interest that never touched the principal. And like the Lucchese operation in New Rochelle, Gielli's two businesses were built to feed each other. The gambling and the lending were connected, so that when a customer could not cover his gambling losses, the bookies would refer him to the loan sharking side of the house. A man would lose a bet he could not afford, and the same organization that had just taken his money would offer to lend him more, at 300%, to cover the loss. One customer, according to the indictment, had placed at least $800,000 in bets over a 10-month period, an illustration of the kind of desperate, compulsive gambler the operation lived on. The enterprise ran out of a string of ordinary-looking businesses in Northeast Philadelphia, coffee shops and a pizza place, and several bars. But its main hub, the place where Gielli and Mustafaraj met with current and prospective borrowers, was a bar Gielli owned on Frankfurt Avenue called the Lion Bar and Grill. On the surface, it was a Mayfair neighborhood tavern. Beneath it, in the basement, was where the real business of the operation was conducted, where the loans were arranged and the terms explained, and, when necessary, where the consequences of falling behind were demonstrated. Gielli was a careful man in some respects. He would often search his customers for weapons and for recording devices before doing business, a precaution that spoke to a certain professional paranoia. But that same care did not extend to restraint, because Gielli's entire method of collection rested on the credible promise of grievous physical harm, and he was not shy about making that promise vivid. The single most telling episode in the entire case, the one that captures Gielli's method more clearly than any statistic, took place in that basement in 2011. A customer who had fallen behind was summoned down to the Lion Bar's basement. Once they were there, Gielli took hold of the man, grabbed his arm, and forced it down flat onto a table. Then he took up a hatchet, and he brought it down onto the table right beside the man's arm, the blade slamming into the wood just next to the flesh, a demonstration of exactly what could be taken from him. And as he did it, Gielli explained the arrangement. It was not himself the man should fear, Gielli suggested, but others. People from New York, he said. These people would take your arm like this. The hatchet in the wood was the argument, and the invocation of shadowy, more powerful men in New York was the frame around it. That customer, according to the indictment, had placed at least $800,000 in bets over a 10-month period, and this was how the organization ensured that a man like that kept paying what he owed. The reference to people from New York was not incidental. It was a deliberate and recurring piece of theater, and it reveals something important about how Gielli's operation actually worked. The Albanians were not part of the Italian-American Mafia, but they understood the value of the Mafia's reputation, and they borrowed it. Over and over, when threatening delinquent customers, members of the organization told them that people from New York, sometimes described as Italian friends, were willing to cause bodily harm to anyone who did not pay. The purpose, investigators concluded, was to create the false impression that these Philadelphia Albanians were part of a larger and more powerful organization, that behind the man with the hatchet stood the vast and terrifying apparatus of the traditional mob. It was a kind of franchising of fear, a trading on a brand name. The Mafia had spent a century teaching America what happened to people who did not pay their debts, and Gielli simply pointed at that reputation and said, in effect, that is who I answer to. That is who will come for you. Whether or not any such Italian friends actually existed hardly mattered. The threat drew its power from 100 years of real bodies in real trunks, and the borrowers, faced with a hatchet in a table, and the invocation of New York, understood it perfectly. The threats were not always about the borrower himself, and that was part of their cruelty. In one case detailed in the indictment, a man who placed sports bets with the gang and could not pay was told that if he did not settle his debt, someone would be sent to push his father around. This is one of the oldest and most effective tools in the collector's kit, the threat against a debtor's family, the understanding that a man who might be willing to gamble with his own safety will collapse at the thought of harm coming to his elderly father or his children. The menace of firearms and hatchets, the promises to break legs and arms, the threats against family members, all of it was deployed almost routinely, the enterprise cultivating its reputation for violence as a deliberate business strategy, because a loan shark's most valuable asset is not his cash, but the certainty in his borrowers' minds that failing to pay will bring pain. What Gelly did not know, as he ran his empire out of the Lion Bar's basement, was that the whole thing had already been penetrated. Among the borrowers who came to him was an FBI undercover agent, and in one recorded meeting, the agent worked out the details of a $50,000 loan with Gelly himself. Gelly, unaware of who he was actually dealing with, delivered to the undercover agent the same promise he delivered to everyone, informing him that his limbs would be broken if he did not pay back what he owed on time. He had, in effect, threatened a federal agent on tape while committing the crime of extortionate lending. And that was only one piece of an enormous evidentiary net. Over the course of the investigation, law enforcement made more than 400 audio recordings and captured numerous surveillance videos of the criminal activity, documenting the loans and the threats and the collections in the operation's own words and images. There was a further irony that helped seal the case, and it is one that runs through several of these modern prosecutions. Gelly's organization, for all its violence, was run like a business, and businesses keep records. When the arrests came in August of 2013, and the FBI executed a series of search warrants at the related businesses, homes, vehicles, and a storage locker, they recovered not just guns and cash, but the documentary machinery of the enterprise: computers, phones, video surveillance, loan applications, and, most damningly, loan ledgers and gambling records. The organization had written down its own crimes, kept books on its usurious loans, and those books became evidence. The same discipline that made the operation efficient and profitable made it convictable. A racket built on keeping borrowers trapped in documented debt cannot easily deny the existence of the documents. The case went to a 6-week federal trial, and the evidence, the 400 recordings and the ledgers, and the testimony of the organization's own customers, and even some of its own members, was overwhelming. In December of 2014, a jury convicted Gelly and Mustafaraj, along with 2 co-defendants who worked as the collectors, finding them guilty of racketeering conspiracy, the collection of unlawful debts, and the extortionate extension and collection of credit, with Gelly and Mustafaraj also convicted on the illegal gambling counts. At sentencing, Gelly remained utterly unrepentant, a posture that says as much about the mindset of the loan shark as anything else in the case. He told the judge that he had done nothing, that everyone was lying, that he, and not his borrowers, was the true victim. At one point, he pointed at one of his accusers in the courtroom and insisted the man was lying, and later, revealingly, he explained why he thought so, saying that whoever testified against him did so only because they owed him money. In his mind, the debt was sacred, and the debtor was the wrongdoer, even in a federal courtroom, even after a hatchet in a basement table, even after threatening a man's father. The judge was unmoved, calling Gelly the clear leader of the operation, and noting that he had expressed absolutely no remorse, and observing that the evidence against him had been overwhelming. Gelly was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison, 168 months, and Mustafaraj, the muscle, to just over 12 years. What makes the story of the Lion Bar such a fitting entry in this account is precisely that Ili Gelly was not a member of the Mafia at all, and yet he ran a textbook Mafia racket, because the racket was never really about ethnicity or heritage or any particular organization. It was about a structure, a set of methods, a way of turning desperate people into perpetual sources of income, and enforcing that arrangement with fear. Gielli borrowed the Italian mob's business model and its reputation both, lending at rates designed to trap, feeding gamblers into the debt from his own betting operation, collecting the weekly vig, and backing it all with the hatchet and the invocation of dangerous men from New York. He proved that the loan shark is not a historical figure but a permanent one, a role that will be filled by whoever is willing to fill it, in whatever community, in whatever decade, as long as there are people desperate enough to borrow money they cannot repay. The face at the top of the operation had changed. The basement, the hatchet, the terrified borrower with his arm on the table, the promise of what would happen to his family, all of it was exactly as old as the racket itself. And when the man with his arm on the table turned out to be an FBI agent with a recorder running, the oldest business in the underworld met one of the newer tools of the law, and for once, the debt that came due was Gielli's own. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case returns to New York and to the Colombo family, where a debt collector of enormous size worked a loan book for a jailed mob soldier, leaning on gamblers and businessmen who fell behind. The borrowers left their weekly payments in a plastic chicken on a porch, and the man who came when they did not was a fearsome figure the whole neighborhood knew to fear. Section 8. Dino Saraceno and Fat Larry Sessa. By the time the 21st century arrived, the Colombo crime family of Brooklyn was a battered and diminished thing, gutted by prosecutions and by its own bloody internal war of the early 1990s, a war that had turned the family against itself and left it weaker than any of the other New York families. But the rackets that had always sustained it continued, and among the men who kept them running in the streets of Bensonhurst and Diker Heights were a jailed soldier named Dino Saraceno and the enormous, ailing enforcer who collected debts for him, a man the neighborhood knew as Fat Larry. Their operation, a six-figure loan-sharking book worked from a Bensonhurst apartment porch, is one of the most vividly documented debt collection operations in the modern record, right down to the strange, almost comic detail at the center of it. When a borrower came to pay his weekly interest, he did not hand it to anyone. He dropped the cash into a plastic chicken sitting on the porch. Dino Saraceno, known as Little Dino, was a maid soldier in the Colombo family, whose criminal life reached back into the family's civil war of the early 1990s, a conflict between a faction loyal to the imprisoned boss Carmine Persico and a faction loyal to the acting boss. Saraceno belonged to the Persico side, and the evidence at his eventual trial established that his racketeering ran from 1991 all the way through 2008, a span of nearly 2 decades that included murder conspiracies from the war years and, later, the loan sharking and extortion that are the concern of this account. He was, in the words of the prosecutor who eventually convicted him, a member of one of the most lethal and feared crews of criminals in the entire Mafia. But even a feared soldier cannot personally chase down every deadbeat borrower, and for that work, Saraceno relied on a specialist. That specialist was Ilario Sessa, called Fat Larry, and to understand why he was so effective it helps to understand what he was. Sessa was a physically overwhelming man, standing around 6'2" and weighing, by various accounts, somewhere between 400 and 450 pounds. His size alone made him an intimidating presence, but his real value lay in his history. Sessa had come up in the Colombo family under one of the most terrifying figures the New York underworld ever produced, Greg Scarpa, a capo nicknamed the Grim Reaper, who was credited with dozens of murders before it emerged, near the end of his life, that he had also been a secret FBI informant for decades. Sessa had been part of a loan-sharking and drug-dealing crew that reported to Scarpa, and he had been an active militant in the family's civil war, attributed with a role in at least one killing as a getaway driver. He had done roughly 10 years in prison for racketeering, attempted murder, and drug dealing, and when he came out in 2005 he was penniless and eager for work. His appearance and his pedigree, his sheer size and his association with the Grim Reaper, made him perfectly suited to the one job he readily took. He became a full-time debt collector. The operation Sessa collected for was Saraceno's loan-sharking book, and after Saraceno himself was jailed in 2008, Sessa kept working it, squeezing the money out of the customers on the boss's behalf. The clientele was the usual cross-section that these operations always produce. There were indebted gamblers who had bet more than they had. There were desperate business people who could not get money from a bank. There were fellow criminals. There were, remarkably, even some of Saraceno's own relatives, borrowing from the family loan shark like anyone else, and subject to the same collection when they fell behind. Every one of them owed the weekly vig, the interest that never seemed to reduce what they owed, and every one of them was expected to pay it on schedule. The mechanism of payment is the detail that makes the operation unforgettable, because it captures so perfectly the strange domestic ordinariness that these rackets take on. Saraceno kept a plastic chicken on the porch of his Bensonhurst apartment, and the borrowers were expected to come by and deposit their weekly interest payments into it. Week after week, men who owed money to the Colombo family would walk up to a porch and stuff cash into a plastic chicken, a collection method as banal as leaving a rent check under a mat, the crushing weekly obligation reduced to a piece of lawn kitsch. And the reason it worked, the reason men reliably fed that chicken, was the second half of the arrangement. If a customer failed to make his deposit, Saraceno, or whoever was running the book, called Sessa. The plastic chicken was the carrot, or rather the routine, the frictionless normal way of paying. Fat Larry was the stick. One borrower turned witness later testified to exactly this understanding, saying that if he did not make his payments, he knew that Sessa would, in the words used, go to work on him. The whole system ran on that knowledge. Feed the chicken, and life goes on. Fail to feed it, and the 400-pound man with the Grim Reaper on his resume comes to find you. What happened when the collection turned violent was laid out in detail at trial, in the case of a debtor identified in court records by the placeholder name Peter Risk. The debt was owed to a Colombo figure named Calabro, and Calabro directed Saraceno and another associate named Competiello to collect it. His instruction, as recounted in the testimony, was blunt and captured the entire ethic of the business in a single line. If the man did not want to hand over the money, Calabro said, then break his face off. Saraceno and his partner went looking for Peter Risk. When they found him, according to the testimony of the men involved, they chased him down, and they stabbed him, and as they did it, they demanded to know why he had not returned Calabro's calls. This is what violent collection actually looks like when it is stripped of the mythology. Two men hunting down a debtor in the street and stabbing him over an unpaid loan and an unreturned phone call. Saraceno himself, by the testimony, later told Calabro plainly that they had stabbed the man. The jury found that Saraceno had violently attempted to collect that loan shark debt, and it became one of the racketeering acts that sent him to prison. The evidence of the broader loan sharking operation was overwhelming and, tellingly, much of it came from the operation's own records and its own people. Multiple witnesses testified about the nature and extent of Saraceno's loan sharking business. Some of them had helped him run it, collecting payments on his behalf, family members and associates who fed the machine. One borrower described his own understanding of the consequences of missing a payment, and crucially, a loan shark ledger was admitted into evidence, the operation's own written record of who owed what, corroborating the witnesses and documenting the business in its own hand. As with Gielli's operation in Philadelphia, the discipline that made the loan book profitable, the careful tracking of every debt and every payment, also made it convictable. The plastic chicken and the ledger and the stabbing of Peter Risk together told the whole story, the routine and the record and the violence that stood behind both. The case that brought it all down was enormous. Saraceno had been arrested in June of 2008 alongside the Colombo family's street boss, Thomas Joeli, and the investigation that produced those arrests eventually led to the prosecution of more than 70 members and associates of the Colombo family, including its leadership, one of the most sweeping strikes against a single family in the modern era. The evidence came in part from within, from associates who had turned and cooperated, and from consensual recordings made by a man who had agreed to wear a wire. In May of 2012, a jury convicted Saraceno of racketeering conspiracy spanning nearly 2 decades, a conspiracy that included 2 murder conspiracies from the Civil War years, the extortionate extension and collection of credit, and witness tampering, along with the substantive loan sharking and obstruction counts. He had not only run and collected the loan book and helped stab Peter Risk over a debt, he had also tried to obstruct the government's investigation by tampering with a witness, attempting to reach back into the case and choke off the testimony against him. In April of 2014, Dino Saraceno was sentenced to 50 years in prison. His co-defendant, the street boss Joeli, convicted of racketeering conspiracy that included 3 murder conspiracies, received a sentence of a little over 18 years. The prosecutor's words at the sentencing captured the meaning of it, noting that Saraceno's ruthless adherence to the Mafia's code of violence had earned him his position as a soldier, but would now cost him decades of his life. Fat Larry Sessa, for his part, was swept up in the wider prosecutions of the Colombo family and pleaded guilty to racketeering charges, serving years in prison, though his sentence was far shorter than Saraceno's. His later life became a kind of grim coda to the whole story. Released and repeatedly returning to prison for parole violations, claiming each time that he was trying to go straight as a used car salesman, while the government caught him using burner phones to stay in contact with his old Colombo associates, Sessa remained tangled in the family until the end, his enormous body finally failing under the weight of morbid obesity, lupus, diabetes, heart disease, and a long list of other ailments. He died in 2026 at the age of 59, the fearsome enforcer reduced in his last years to a sick man shuffling behind a walker, still, to the end, unable to fully leave the life. What the Saraceno and Sessa operation reveals, set alongside the older and bloodier cases in this account, is how the debt collection machine survived into the modern era in a diminished, almost domesticated form, without losing any of its essential cruelty. There were no meat hooks here, no torture chambers, no bodies in trunks. There was a plastic chicken on a porch and a ledger in a drawer, and most weeks the whole thing ran on nothing more dramatic than a man dropping cash into a lawn ornament. But underneath that mundane surface, the machine was exactly what it had always been. The routine was possible only because of the threat, and the threat was real, as Peter Risk learned when he was chased down and stabbed over a debt and an unreturned call. The plastic chicken worked because Fat Larry existed. The Colombo family, battered and reduced and half destroyed, had lost most of its power and most of its members, but it had not lost the core insight that ran through every operation in this account, from Mad Sam DeStefano's basement to the Lion Bar's cellar, the insight that a debt is only worth what your willingness to enforce it is worth. Little Dino Saraceno and Fat Larry Sessa enforced it the old way, with a knife in a Brooklyn street, and the 50-year sentence that followed was the price of a business run on a plastic chicken and the certain knowledge of what waited for anyone who failed to fill it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves from the old rackets to the newest one, a scheme so modern it reached into professional basketball and used hidden cameras and rigged card-shuffling machines to cheat wealthy players out of millions. When the victims realized they had been robbed and refused to pay, 4 of New York's 5 families reached for the oldest tool of all. Section 9, Operation Royal Flush. For nearly a century, the story of the Mafia debt collection has been a story of the same handful of props: the meat hook in the basement, the trunk of a Cadillac, the hatchet on the table, the plastic chicken on the porch. But in October of 2025, federal prosecutors in Brooklyn unsealed an indictment that showed the oldest business in the underworld, dressed in the newest technology imaginable, a scheme that reached into the National Basketball Association and ran high-stakes poker games rigged with hidden cameras, X-ray tables, and shuffling machines that could read an entire deck. The investigation was called Operation Royal Flush, and it charged more than 30 defendants, including a Basketball Hall of Famer, and it drew together an extraordinary combination of forces: current and former professional athletes on one side, and, on the other, capos and soldiers from 4 of New York's legendary 5 families. And when the wealthy victims of these rigged games realized they had been cheated and refused to pay what they supposedly owed, the families reached, as they always have, for the oldest tool of all. They collected the debt by force. The scheme, as prosecutors described it, was a marvel of engineering and deception. It ran for years, from at least 2019, and it operated a traveling circuit of underground high-stakes poker games in Manhattan, Miami, Las Vegas, and the Hamptons. Luxurious games that presented themselves as elite entertainment. Wealthy investors and celebrities gathered over enormous pots. But the entire thing was a performance, scripted down to the shuffle. As the U.S. attorney put it, what the victims, whom the operators called the fish, did not know was that everyone else at the table, from the dealer to the players to the celebrity guests, was in on the scam. And the methods by which they cheated read less like a mob operation than like a heist film. The centerpiece was the rigged shuffling machine. These were ordinary, off-the-shelf card shuffling machines that had been secretly altered so that they could read every card in the deck as it was shuffled, determine which player at the table held the best hand, and transmit that information wirelessly to an off-site operator. That operator would then relay the information by cell phone to a co-conspirator seated at the table, a cheater the operation referred to as the quarterback or the driver, who would use secret signals, a tap of the chin, the touch of a colored chip, to communicate to the other planted players who was going to win the hand. The shuffling machines were only the beginning of the arsenal. Prosecutors described poker chip trays fitted with hidden cameras that could secretly read the cards on the table. They described special contact lenses and eyeglasses that allowed the wearer to see secret markings, barcodes invisible to the naked eye, printed on the cards. They described card analyzers hidden in decoy cell phones, and most remarkably of all, they described tables built with X-ray equipment capable of reading cards that were lying face down, transmitting that information back through the system. It was a complete apparatus of cheating, a table at which the house did not merely watch the game, but controlled it entirely, in which every card, and every player, and every outcome was known in advance to everyone except the victim who was being fleeced. Once a game was underway, prosecutors said, the defendants fleeced the victims out of tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars per game, and over the life of the operation, they took an estimated $7 million or more from their marks. The role played by the athletes is what made the case a national sensation, and it is worth understanding, precisely because it illustrates how the operation lured its victims. The most prominent of them was Chauncey Billups, a five-time NBA All-Star, the Finals MVP of the 2004 Detroit Pistons championship team, a man beloved in Detroit as Mr. Big Shot, who had been inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame and was, at the time of his arrest, the head coach of the Portland Trail Blazers. Another was Damon Jones, a former NBA player and assistant coach. In the operation's own terminology, men like Billups and Jones were the face cards. Their function was to lend the rigged game's star power and legitimacy, to serve as bait. A wealthy amateur gambler would be far more willing to sit down at a high-stakes table and to keep playing as he lost, if he believed he was matching wits with a famous champion, if he could tell his friends he had played poker against Mr. Big Shot. The presence of the celebrity made the whole thing feel like a glamorous privilege rather than a trap. Prosecutors captured the effect in one grimly telling detail from the indictment, noting that during one game, an organizer observed that a particular victim seemed eager to hand Billups his money because the man was, in the word used, starstruck. The star power was not incidental to the fraud. It was a load-bearing part of the machine, the honeypot that drew the fish to the table. Both Billups and Jones have pleaded not guilty, and Billups's attorney has insisted that his client is a man of integrity who would never risk his Hall of Fame legacy in such a scheme. Their guilt or innocence is for a jury to decide when the case goes to trial. But the structure prosecutors described, the celebrity as bait, is the frame around everything that follows. Now we arrive at the part of the story that places it squarely in this account, because a rigged poker game, however sophisticated, is only a con until the moment the victim refuses to pay, and that is where the Mafia came in. The illegal poker games, prosecutors said, were run under the protection of New York's organized crime families, and the operators were required to share a portion of their proceeds with them, a street tax on the whole enterprise, tribute paid to the Gambino, the Genovese, and the Bonanno families, with the Lucchese family also named among the four families involved in the broader indictment. The NIP commissioner called it extraordinarily rare to see 4 of the 5 families brought together in a single indictment, a measure of how deep and how wide the operation ran. And in exchange for their cut, the families provided the one service that no piece of cheating technology could provide. They provided the muscle. When a victim who had been robbed at a rigged table balked at paying his supposed losses, when a fleeced Mark realized something was wrong and refused to hand over the money, members and associates of the crime families carried out acts of assault, extortion, and robbery to ensure the debts were paid and the operation kept running. The X-ray table and the rigged shuffler created the debt. The Mafia collected it. The details of that collection, drawn from the defendant's own text messages, show that beneath all the 21st century gadgetry, the actual enforcement was as crude and physical as anything in the older cases in this account. One organizer, faced with a victim who had not paid a gambling debt, sent the man a message in 2022 that could have been spoken in any era of the mob, telling him that his winning was over now, and that he had been running his mouth unchecked. Then, prosecutors say, the organizer punched the victim in the face and afterward bragged about it in a message to an associate, writing that he had punched somebody in the face the other day and that things were unraveling quickly. That was not the end of it. The same victim was approached and attacked again later, this time by the organizer and 3 other men. Nearly a year afterward, the victim texted his tormentor a line that captures the whole grim reality behind the glamour, telling him that what he had done was cowardly and ridiculous, that he had sent a bunch of goons to solve his problems. And there was worse. Prosecutors described a gunpoint robbery carried out to obtain one of the rigged shuffling machines, an armed stick-up over a piece of cheating equipment, and a pattern of extortions perpetrated against victims specifically to ensure they repaid what the rigged games had taken from them. The NIPT commissioner distilled the entire operation into a single sentence. They marketed luxury, she said, but what they sold was violence. There is a genuine continuity here, across nearly 100 years and a vast gulf of technology, that is worth dwelling on, because it is the whole point of understanding a case like this. Strip away the shuffling machines and the X-ray tables and the celebrity face cards, and what remains is the identical structure that governs Sam DiStefano's juice loans in Chicago and Nicky Scarfo's street tax in Philadelphia. A person is maneuvered into owing money to the mob. He does not truly owe it in any just sense, any more than a man tortured over a gambling marker or taxed for the right to run his own book truly owes it. But the mob has decided he owes it, and the mob's decision is what matters. And when he will not pay, the collection proceeds through violence, through the punch in the face, and the goons at the door, and the gun in the ribs. The gambling operation manufactures the debt, exactly as the loan sharking operations in New Rochelle and Philadelphia use their betting arms to funnel losers into the debt trap, and then the enforcers collect it. The technology at the front end had leapt forward a century. The collection at the back end was pure 1930s. A rigged table in the Hamptons produced a debt, and a fist in a man's face collected it, and in between sat the same organizations, taking their cut, that have been doing this since the days of the meat hook. The case is also a reminder, and perhaps the most striking one in this entire account, that the Mafia is not the historical curiosity that popular culture has made it. The 5 families are diminished, their great bosses long dead or imprisoned, their old empires broken by decades of the very kind of prosecution that Operation Royal Flush represents. And yet here they were in 2025, 4 of the 5 acting together, embedded in a scheme that touched the NBA and stretched across 11 states, still doing precisely what they have always done, protecting an illegal gambling operation, taking tribute from it, and supplying the violence that makes the whole thing work. The FBI director called it a criminal enterprise that enveloped both the NBA and La Cosa Nostra, and described the fraud as mind-boggling, tens of millions of dollars across a multi-year investigation. The investigation itself, prosecutors said, began to unravel the scheme when a disgruntled participant tipped off authorities to the impossible patterns of winning at the tables, and from there, hidden surveillance, seized hardware, and the defendant's own text messages exposed the machinery of manipulation. The legal reckoning is still unfolding as of this writing, and it must be said clearly that the charges are allegations, that the defendants are presumed innocent, and that Billups, Jones, and others have pleaded not guilty and will have their day in court, with a trial anticipated for late 2026. All 31 defendants in the poker case face their proceedings, some on charges of wire fraud and money laundering conspiracy, others on charges of running an illegal gambling business, robbery conspiracy, and extortion conspiracy. Whatever the individual outcomes, the indictment itself has already accomplished something. It has laid bare, in the language of text messages and seized X-ray tables, the persistence of the oldest racket in a form no one could have imagined a generation ago. The victims of Operation Royal Flush were not desperate men borrowing grocery money from a neighborhood shark. They were wealthy people lured into glittering games by the promise of playing cards with a champion, and they were robbed by machines of astonishing sophistication. But when they refused to pay, the thing that came for them was not sophisticated at all. It was a punch in the face, a gun, a group of men at the door, the same collection that has closed every story in this account, delivered by the same families, for the same reason. The debt had been declared, and the debt would be collected, and it did not matter that the debt itself was a fiction spun out of hidden cameras and marked cards. Once the mob says you owe, and the only question left is how the collection comes. For the fish at these tables, it came the way it has always come, in blood and fear, behind a curtain of luxury, in the oldest language the underworld knows. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case is not a single killing or a single scheme, but the thread that has run through all of them. The logic that turned a loan into a leash, and a debt into a death sentence. It is worth stepping back, one last time, to ask what all of these collections, across a century of American crime, were really about. Section 10, the ledger. Every story in this account has ended the same way, with a body, or a broken bone, or a man handing cash into a plastic chicken, and it is worth pausing, at the close of all of it, to ask what these collections were really about, because the answer turns out to be older and simpler and stranger than any single one of them. It was never at bottom about the money. A $25,000 skim, a weekly street tax, a poker debt spun out of hidden cameras. These sums were real, but they were never the true reason a man was hung on a meat hook, or burned in a basement, or shot on his own corner. The real reason lived underneath the numbers, in a logic that the Mafia understood better than any bank ever has, and it is that logic, more than any individual killer, that is the actual subject of this list. The debt was never a number, it was a leash, and what the collectors were really protecting, every time they collected, was the one thing the whole underworld economy rested on, the certainty, held in the mind of every borrower and every debtor and every associate, that a debt to these men would be paid, one way or another, always. To see why that certainty mattered so much, it helps to understand where the whole business came from, because the loan shark was not born with the Mafia. The street corner racket that fed the great crime families had roots going back to the years after the Civil War, when so-called salary lenders preyed on working people who could not get a loan from any respectable institution, and the press, watching these lenders circle the desperate, gave them the name that stuck: sharks. The particular form the mob inherited was known in the 1920s and 1930s as the 6 for 5 racket, and its arithmetic tells you everything. 6 for 5 meant that a borrower, who took $5 on a Monday, owed $6 the following Monday. $1 of interest on a $5 loan, 20% in a single week, which works out to more than 1,000% a year. The interest was called the juice, or the vig, short for vigorish, and it was due every week for as long as the principal remained unpaid, and the principal could usually be reduced only in a single lump sum that the borrower, by design, could rarely assemble. This was the machine at the heart of every case in this list, from Sam DiStefano's juice loans in 1950s Chicago, to the 200% debt trap in New Rochelle, to the 395% loans in the basement of the Lion Bar. The rate was never meant to be paid off. It was meant to keep the borrower on the leash forever, but a leash is only as good as the fear behind it, and this is the second truth that runs through every story here. A loan shark's most valuable possession was never his cash. It was his reputation for violence. Scholars who studied the loan shark industry in the 1960s reached a conclusion that at first seemed surprising, that the most important factor inducing borrowers to repay was not the actual application of violence, but the credible threat of it, conveyed through the lender's physique, his temperament, his willingness to carry a weapon, and above all his connection to a criminal organization, whether that connection was real or merely believed. A formidable reputation, the researchers found, made the individual collector's job easy because it removed the need for most actual violence. Fear did the work that fists would otherwise have to do. This is why Fat Larry Sessa's 400 pounds and his history with the Grim Reaper made him such an effective collector without his having to touch most of the men who owed. It is why Alighieri invoked people from New York, borrowing the reputation of the Italian families he was not even part of. The whole system was designed to run, most of the time, on nothing but the borrower's understanding of what could happen. The plastic chicken worked because everyone knew who stood behind it, and yet the fear could not be a bluff, and that is the terrible hinge on which all of these deaths turned. A reputation for violence is worthless the moment it is revealed to be only a reputation. If a single debtor could skim the money and vanish, if a single associate could refuse to pay and simply walk away, if word got around that a debt to these men could be defaulted on without consequence, then the leash would slip off every neck at once, and the entire economy would collapse. This is the reason the violence in these stories was so wildly out of proportion to the sums involved. Peter Cappelletti was tortured for 3 days over $25,000, chained to a radiator, and burned while a banquet went on in the next room. Not because $25,000 was worth 3 days of a man's agony, but because every other collector in Chicago needed to know what happened to a man who took Sam DiStefano's money and ran. The torture was not really aimed at Cappelletti. It was aimed at everyone who would ever be tempted to do what Cappelletti did. The victim was the message, and the audience was the entire underworld. This is why so many of these killings were made deliberately visible. The body left in a trunk on a busy street. The man shot on a corner in front of the neighborhood children. The enforcer hung on a meat hook where others would hear of it. A quiet killing protects no reputation. A collection has to be seen, or at least known, to do its work. There is a phrase from another corner of organized crime that captures the philosophy exactly, the choice the cartels famously offered to those in their path. Silver or lead, the bribe or the bullet. Take the money and cooperate, or take the consequences. The Mafia's version of debt collection was the same offer inverted. Pay the vig, or take the lead. And the genius of it, the cold institutional genius, was that the organization almost always preferred to be paid. Actual violence, the researchers noted, was in many ways counterproductive from the organization's standpoint, because it drew the scrutiny of police and public and rival gangs alike. A dead borrower pays no more juice. What the mob wanted was a live borrower, frightened and reliable, feeding the chicken week after week for years. The killings in this account were, in a sense, the system's failures, the cases where the leash broke and had to be replaced with a corpse to keep all the other leashes tight. Every man who died here died so that 100 men who owed money would keep paying without having to be touched. Look back across the 10 cases with that understanding, and a single shape emerges from all of them. Mad Sam DiStefano, torturing his own collectors and luring Leo Foreman to a basement, was protecting the certainty that his juice would be feared. Action Jackson, hung on the meat hook, was that same certainty written in the flesh of a suspected traitor, a warning to every other collector in the outfit. Roy DeMeo, running his loan book into the machine of the Gemini Lounge, and then dying in the trunk of his own car, was both the enforcer of the leash and, in the end, its victim, killed because he himself had become an uncontrollable liability, a debt the Gambino family could no longer carry. Tony Spilotro collected the mob's tribute in the desert and was collected in turn in an Indiana cornfield when he became the liability. Frankie Flowers refused to keep paying the street tax and was beaten, then killed, so that no other bookmaker in Philadelphia would imagine that Nicky Scarfo could be refused. The New Rochelle operation and the Lion Bar, and the Colombo loan book all ran the same debt trap. The interest engineered never to end. The collection backed by the hatchet and the fist and the knife. And Operation Royal Flush, with its X-ray tables and its celebrity face cards, proved that a century of technological change had altered everything about the front end of the racket and nothing at all about the back end, where a punch in the face still collected a debt that a machine had invented. The through line is not the meat hook or the trunk or the basement. Those were only instruments, interchangeable, whatever came to hand. The through line is the ledger, the running account in which every dollar loaned created an obligation, and every obligation had to be honored or answered for. An account kept not on paper, most of the time, but in the shared understanding of everyone who did business in that world. That ledger was the real thing the collectors served. It did not care about the size of the entry. A skimmed $25,000 and a refused street tax and a $7 million poker fraud were all the same to it, because what mattered was never the amount but the principle, the inviolable rule that the account must balance. A debt that went uncollected was a hole in the ledger, and a hole in the ledger was a crack in the fear, and a crack in the fear was the beginning of the end of the whole enterprise. So the account was always made to balance, in cash if possible, in blood if necessary, and the choice between those two currencies was the only real choice the borrower ever had. It is tempting, watching the great families fall to decades of prosecutions, to imagine that this logic died with them, that the ledger closed. It did not. The scholars who traced the history of mob lending noticed something uncomfortable at the end of the story, which is that the loan shark in the original sense never truly disappeared. He adapted, went quiet, changed his packaging, moved into new communities and new technologies, but the fundamental structure, the loan designed to trap, the interest that never ends, the collection backed by fear, survived intact because the conditions that create it never went away. As long as there are people who cannot get money any other way and are desperate enough to borrow it at any price, there will be someone willing to lend it at that price and to collect it by whatever means the price requires. The face at the top changes. It was Italian, then it was Albanian, then it was a table full of NBA gamblers and 4 crime families at once. The basement changes, from a Chicago bungalow to a Philadelphia bar to a rigged card room in the Hamptons. But the arithmetic of 6 for 5, and the reputation for violence, and the corpse, left as a message to the living, have proven to be among the most durable inventions in the history of American crime, outlasting the bosses who perfected them, outlasting the very organizations that made them famous. The men and the one woman in these 10 stories were, almost all of them, ordinary in the end, small figures caught in a machine far larger than themselves. Some were collectors who skimmed, some were borrowers who fell behind, some were bookmakers who would not pay a tax, some were simply liabilities the organization decided to erase. What united them was that each became, at the moment of his death or his beating, an entry that had to be settled, a line in the ledger that the collectors could not allow to stand open. They were killed, not for who they were, but for what an unpaid debt would mean if it were allowed to go unanswered. That is the coldest fact in all of this, colder than the meat hook, or the basement, or the trunk. Behind every brutal collection in the history of the American Mafia stood not rage, not even greed exactly, but arithmetic, the pitiless bookkeeping of an underworld that understood, more clearly than any legitimate institution ever has, that a debt is only ever worth the fear that stands behind it, and that the moment the fear fails, everything fails. So they kept the fear alive the only way they knew how, one collection at a time, one body at a time, one warning at a time, balancing a ledger that could never be closed and was never meant to be, because the balancing itself was the business, and the business, as every story here has shown, was always paid in blood. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.